Hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I'm here with a distinguished friend of mine, Frederick Clarkson, author of Eternal Hostility, a man that I've known since the 80s when he interviewed me about my involvement with the Moonies. He's been researching right-wing organizations with an organization called the Political Research Associates. In fact, he's the senior research analyst for them currently. And he recently wrote an important piece that's online in Rewire. And I said, "Hey, Fred, would you do an interview with me?" And you said, "Sure." So thank you for taking the time.
Well, you're very welcome. Anytime, Steve.
So Fred, give us the short elevator speech to get people interested in this whole video, and then we can flesh it out a little bit. What are the key issues that you're working on right now, and what the public needs to know about, please?
Well, my main work has been about the issues related to religious freedom that have been much in the news. It was one of the main campaign themes of the 2016 presidential campaign, and a lot of legislation at the federal and state level, lots of new regulations coming out of the Trump administration, and lots and lots of litigation and public battle around it. So religious freedom is one of the central issues of our time, but most of our society has kind of taken it for granted as an issue. We think we kind of know what it is, but we kind of really don't. And you'll find very few people, except for the real hardcore issue activists, who know very much about it. But it's one of those things that's kind of, it's being redefined in problematic ways, and it's kind of taking over our public discourse. And my work is to try to help us all catch up.
Great. So is it safe to say that there are people with an agenda to impose their own theocratic ideas on the rest of us who may not necessarily subscribe to them?
That would be fair. This is a very Orwellian idea, where tyranny is freedom and freedom is tyranny. In this case, religious freedom is being used as an excuse to try to impose religious and other kinds of ideas on everybody else. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary development in our history. And we're through those same legal and legislative means that I mentioned before. Those are the arenas in which it's happening. So yes, if you're concerned about women's reproductive freedom, if you're concerned about LGBTQ civil rights, or if you're simply concerned about the religious rights of people who are not the theocrats, everybody's rights are in danger by this movement right now.
Yeah, and I will never forget, and I'm indebted to you for your pointing out when I was doing the update to combating cult mind control, the point that when the Moonies lied to me at Queens College, they were infringing on my religious freedom by using undue influence and later coercion to make me accept that version of reality that really, if I had known in advance, I would have agreed to a right-wing fascist Korean messiah figure.
Yeah, and that your situation and that of many others is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, how we, as a society, we sort of lost sight of what religious freedom is supposed to be. And how is it possible that we can tolerate, right, in the name of religious freedom, the conning people out of their most sacred ideas of self, their ideas about God, their ideas about the cosmos, and to use tactics that, if used to fleece you out of your money, right, would be a criminal offense. Felony might put you away for 20 years.
Exactly. In fact, I've always said there are more laws to protect people from buying a used car than getting recruited into Scientology or the Moonies or any number of other cult groups.
Well, that's right. You can you can buy a lot of stuff from used cults too.
Yeah, exactly. So talk to us about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and how, now that Brett Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court, what the public needs to be aware of and concerns about, as you were saying, the redefinition of what is religious freedom. What do we need to know about that?
Well, yeah, very briefly, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is kind of a complicated idea that was well-intentioned and very bipartisan back when it was passed in the early 90s. And basically what it sought to do was to create a very high bar to prevent the government from interfering with individual religious rights. And so there's a lot of complicated language about, sincere beliefs and undue burdens and all this kind of stuff, but that's the basic idea.
Mm-hmm.
But it set the bar very, very, very high, so it'd be very difficult for it's easy to abuse the idea of religious freedom in the way that we've been talking about under what's called RFRA for short.
Mm-hmm.
But we saw it most dramatically in the controversial Supreme Court case around Hobby Lobby, which basically meant that this big corporation could deny contraceptive coverage of certain sorts to its employees because they believed, right? Science, never mind, but they believed that these contraceptives caused abortions. And this was an interesting interpretation of the law because it meant that it was no longer about individuals and the government. It was about a third party, right? A third party could say, oh no, we can interfere with your religious rights and your other rights as individuals in the name of religious freedom. And that has become a new standard for laws and other court cases all around the country. It was also the first time that a corporation was allowed to declare a religious identity for legal purposes in this way. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the redefinition.
Mm-hmm. And I guess what's coming up for me is the Supreme Court's agreement or with an interpretation of Citizens United that a corporation should have the same rights as people to give unlimited funds for political electioneering.
Well, yeah, that's right. And basically, the court a long time ago decided that money is speech. It's essentially the equivalent of speech.
Uh-huh.
So that's a direction that jurisprudence is going with the Supreme Court. So yeah, we can expect to see more of this. But let me offer one example that came up just in the past few days that, to my mind, was very dramatic. Now, most of the issues under RFRA and the Hobby Lobby decision of the court to do with creating zones of exemption from the law. And that is, for say, a Catholic hospital. And you didn't want to have to provide health care to LGBTQ people, you could declare a right of conscience to not do that. Now, that's still a matter of litigation, but those are the kinds of issues that are coming up all over the place right now. But a new one came up that was shocking to me. I kind of expected it to happen, but it's always shocking when it finally does. Mm. And that was that there was a religious-based adoption and foster care provider called Miracle Hill in South Carolina. And they were denying prospective parents in foster care homes if they were Jews, or if they were Catholics, or if they were the wrong kind of Protestant, or atheists, or agnostics. You had to be the right kind of evangelical Protestant in order to receive their services. Now, that kind of bigotry is not entirely surprising, but in this case, they were receiving federal funds to provide adoption services, and the state of South Carolina has asked the Trump administration for an exemption so that Miracle Hill can continue to discriminate against Jews and others entirely on this religious basis.
It seems to me an incredibly slippery slope if you start allowing, entities like this to discriminate, to deprive other people of their rights as citizens, as Americans, and whoever is in power gets to decide who's a legitimate Christian and who isn't a legitimate Christian, and it's smacks of mind control to me in terms of Lifton's dispensing of existence. If you are part of the party, then you have a right to exist, and therefore you have advantages and rights. And then if you leave or you don't believe, then you're an outsider, and therefore anything is justifiable.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is what the framers of the Constitution were up to back in the day. They understood that that if it's a government and the church, or church in those days, could be any religion, were essentially merged, where you had to be a member of the correct sect to vote and hold public office, and then the government could shovel money in your direction, you would be dispensing, the existence or the rights of citizenship, right, according to religious grounds.
Mm-hmm.
Good bit of what the American Revolution and ultimately the framing of the Constitution was about, throwing off the established churches and the theocratic order in which these things happened. So when Madison and Jefferson were figuring out the ideas that led to the First Amendment and the ideas of freedom of religion, they weren't thinking it as being about religion per se. They thought about it synonymously with the freedom of the mind, or the freedom of conscience, as they put it.
Mm-hmm.
So freedom of religion was the negotiated term of choice. It wasn't about religion per se. The freedom of religion is a right, and it's a right that belongs to all of us. But there are people who want to redefine what the nature of religious freedom is for their own sectarian interests.
So this is the heart of the issue as I understand it, and I just want to state it as if I understand it correctly, the framers, the founders of the Constitution of our American democracy wanted separation between church and state, and wanted a situation where people had the freedom to believe whatever they wanted to, but when it came to practice or to behaviors, they would intervene to protect other people's behaviors in terms of action of religion. Or am I misrepresenting it?
Well, there's always been some tension, about how far you can act out based on your beliefs. But basically, the standard is, you can believe anything you want and act on those beliefs as long as it's otherwise in compliance with the law.
Mm-hmm.
So, to what extent there might be some accommodation, like in modern times, in our time, in employment. If the Christian and Jewish holidays would be respected by employers, right? And that was a reasonable accommodation in employment for those things. But the idea of conscience now has been extended by what we were talking about with RFRA and the various court decisions, such that people who want to discriminate on the basis of gender and sexual orientation, or as we said in the Miracle Hill example, on the basis of religion itself, there is being latitude extended to those kinds of discriminatory acts in the name of conscience. So conscience has been separated out by the discriminators from the original idea of religious freedom. So now it's religious freedom and conscience is what they're proposing, which allows them a more expansive opportunities to act on their beliefs, which in many cases will be discriminatory against the beliefs of others.
When I hear you describe it like that, I think back to my time in the Moonies, where my real conscience got suppressed by my Moonie identity, so that it was not only ethical for me to lie to people to raise money or to bring them into the cult, but I was doing them a favor. I was doing them a service by giving them an opportunity to help the Messiah by giving money or by saving 10 generations of their ancestors. And so this whole issue of conscience, when I was in the Moon cult, my conscience was redefined by what the cult defined as what was morality and what was real. And so for me, that means, really there's no civil rights and no human rights that would be exempt eventually from the ruling powers who are defining, the truth and what God wants for us. Am I wrong? Am I right?
Well, that's certainly the intention for various groups. Now, remember, not everybody's quite on the same page. I mean, the Moonies may not be on quite the same page as the Catholics or on conservative evangelicals. In fact, if you take your Miracle Hill variety evangelicals, if you're a Mooney or a Catholic, they're not going to provide any adoption services for you.
Right. Right.
So at some point, the theocrats are at odds.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, people begin to recognize that we're all in this together, So it's not a hopeless situation.
So I want to ask you, because I've heard some people talking this way, that they believe that the America is a Christian nation, and that ultimately God has chosen America, and therefore God has plans for America, which is what I also believed in the Moonies. Of course, it was to serve a Korean Messiah. And then there's something called Dominionism and such. Can you shed any light on your knowledge about these points?
Well, sure. The idea that America was founded as a Christian nation is kind of a bit of revisionist history. That those who want to impose their contemporary ideas for Christianity and reinterpret religious freedom and other matters of law and constitutional doctrine, they can say, oh, well, that's what the founding fathers intended all along. That's the gist of Christian nationalism, that God and the founding fathers were somehow all on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
And I should point out that when we talk about the founding fathers, we're talking about everybody from the Pilgrims to George Washington, and all 150 years of the colonial era, and all the different people, as if they were all in agreement in exactly the same way, which is silly on its face.
Mm-hmm.
The more extreme version of Christian nationalism is something that we call Dominionism, and that comes out of the book of Genesis and the idea that man shall have dominion over the earth. So this idea of dominion, and particularly a conservative Christian kind of dominion, takes on political implications. And there's a whole body of theocratic theology called Christian Reconstructionism that's at the root of a lot of this stuff. But there are many other varieties as well. But so the idea of being involved, being politically engaged, and having a particular conservative Christian vision, like, say, Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, he's a well-known dominionist, means that everything that you do in life, everything you do in politics and public policy, is geared towards the incremental steps it takes to achieve that kind of Christian dominion in politics and government and other areas of life.
Mm-hmm. And is it safe to say that dominionists might look at Judaism or Islam as negative, enemies of that assertion of dominion?
Well, sure. And, understanding that there are tactical matters and strategic matters here. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Jews, they can invoke the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they don't really want to sound anti-Semitic because of its history in the United States. But of course, being anti-Muslim, that's politically very convenient to do. So you'll hear an awful lot of Muslim baiting and not too much Jew baiting from this crowd, although many of them are deeply anti-Semitic, and there's lots of literature to show that.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the end, if you really take this kind of conservative Christian vision seriously, there's room for tolerance for a while, but in the end, you win.
And Fred, is it safe to say that, to your knowledge, dominionists believe in the apocalypse and Armageddon, and that they may buy into the resistance to the recognition of 97% of the scientists who say there's global climate change and we need to do something to save the earth, and somehow they think that because the God is in judgment mode, God will take care of everything magically and mysteriously?
Well, the short answer is yes. There are many varieties of dominionism and conservative evangelical thought, and lots of theologies. So that once upon a time, when certain kinds of Christian apocalyptic thinkers were in ascendance. Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson used to think this way. And they used to see they used to look at the world through the lens of whatever happens in Israel as sort of a gauge of God's time clock as to when the end times would appear. But that kind of theology has shifted a bit, and they're not quite as focused on those things. Mm-hmm. The more dominionist you are, the less concerned about Israel you generally are as well. Mm-hmm. They're much more interested in the long-term plodding theocratic vision. The great theologian of Christian Reconstructionism, R.J. Rushton, he thought it would take thousands of years. Some of his colleagues thought tens of thousands of years to arrive at the perfect Christian dominion. Others are in more of a big fat hurry, and we see them much more politically engaged these days.
Uh-huh. And I read recently that there's a movie out called The Trump Prophecy, and that I think it was Robertson said that he saw a vision of Trump by the right-hand side of God. I don't know if I'm making an accurate quote, but in our final minutes, do you want to comment at all about the somehow connection of thinking that Trump is somehow an agent of God on earth?
Sure. I mean, I haven't seen the film yet, but I look forward to it. But there's a lot of that kind of prophetic view about the role of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And been a number of dominionist thinkers and spokespeople who talked about that. And it goes to the idea that God sometimes uses ungodly men to achieve his purposes. Mm-hmm. King David and Cyrus, from the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And Cyrus is a particularly famous example because he was a pagan king, right, in Babylon, who freed Jews after 70 years and helped to build the temple. And so here's a pagan king who achieved God's purposes. So it's said that Donald Trump has the Cyrus anointing. Uh-huh. And this gives people the chance to say, well, he's an ungodly man. That explains a lot of the other stuff, but he's achieving God's purposes. And that's why they support him.
Wow. So we're going to need to wrap this up, but what can people do if they're watching this, reading my blog? What action steps might you suggest for people to learn more about your work and PRA, and just what else they might be able to do with this knowledge?
Well, yeah, you begin with trying to reclaim what religious freedom is. You can certainly use my work, but you can easily find the work of others as well who are working in this field. Because, if we're going to fight the dominionists and the theocrats and others who are attacking the religious freedom of the rest of us, we need to know in our bones what that means. Now, sometimes, I know you've experienced this, Steve, and that is sometimes if you're critical of these groups, you'll be accused of religious bigotry. Mm-hmm. So I think that one thing we need to know, and will be the basis for everything we do, is if we know what the difference between religious bigotry and fair criticism is, it will inform all of our thinking and all of our actions from there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and just to cite my own work, if I can, because it's my interview, just the influence continuum and healthy religion gives informed consent, is accountable, responsible, transparent. Mm-hmm. There are checks and balances, real ethical guidelines, as opposed to the deceptive manipulation, use of fear and guilt, asking people for loyalty or blind obedience, telling people they can't talk to critics or former members or scholars like yourself, that one can really start to suss out. For me, real religion implies that God made us unique and wants us to make our own decisions and not just be obedient as a slave. However you want to understand the Garden of Eden story, Almighty God could have made Adam and Eve clones and robots and slaves, but somehow the grand plan, this is how I think about it, was to really have diversity and to have unique expressions of the divine in so many different ways, and not just say there's only one right way and get rid of everybody else who doesn't think that way. So I want to thank you for all your good work, and thanks for all your good counsel over the years. And hopefully people will watch this, share it, embed it, and some more consciousness will come about. And what we need are, and we were talking about this on the phone, more people need to become educated citizens. We need more people to register to vote and participate in our democracy to make it healthy, because it's not healthy if so few people are voting and people are pouring billions of dollars to influence people one way or the other. That's not going to work.
Yeah, in 2014, the other last midterm elections, there was only 36% turnout, and even the best projections don't go much higher than that. So with both religious freedom and the democratic structure that allows us to have it, we're in a use it or lose it situation here.
Yeah.
Time for us to think this through quickly and mobilize as best we can.
Great. Thank you for your good work, Fred. And we will be in touch.